Welcome to Vibrant Visions Conversation, the podcast. I'm Maxine Grant, your host, and I firmly believe that a purpose driven life is when one fulfills their ultimate expression of themselves. And during these sessions, we'll connect with a variety of business professionals, community influencers, and spiritual leaders, and be actively present with you as we walk together on your journey of moving from existing to living in a real world of experiences in a digital age, and aspire to inspire the heart of the entrepreneur. Thank you for joining me. I'm Maxine, your host, and joining me today I have Kashmir Burke, and I also have Dr. Andrew Blackwood, who will be joining me. Today we're making awareness, call it like celebrating CAMH Mental Health Week. Kashmir comes to me, we've worked with each other, I guess, say about 20 years or so. Andrew, I've had the pleasure of working with in the community. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the life that everyone is experiencing during the pandemic and after the pandemic, and how that has impacted the community. We're also going to touch on going back to work in the after the mandate has been lifted, and what are some of those psychological impacts that we're seeing in the community and how it's resulting with the employers and the awareness and support that the community is receiving. So I'd like to thank Kashmir again for joining me. And I'd like to learn a little bit more. I know about you a little bit, but you also are kind of like, like you're kind of cloaked a bit, if I can say, kind of like a little Star Trek there. He's cloaked a bit because he has such a great personality. Kashmir is a business owner or co-founder of The True North. He's a business consultant. He comes to us from the UK, and has resided here with his family. He's a family man as well too, and he's very passionate. Kashmir also knows my mom, so in terms of integrity, I think we're all suited for a really good conversation. Kashmir, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
First of all, thank you for inviting me here, Maxine. A pleasure to be here. My background really began in finance, but it's also based a lot on failure and frustration. And I found finance very frustrating because I found that all the things that we were measuring in finance were actually assumptions and projections weren't real. That led me into operational excellence and lean and to Toyota Way and Toyota Production System to try to get more to how institutions work. But as the more I got into that, I realized the power of institutions. And I think that was the turning point for me, is learning that we can work with individuals, but the power of an institution, be it a religion, be it a corporation, be it a community, has to be dealt with. And what I discovered in that process of working through operational improvement and efficiencies is you've got to get to the culture, and you've got to get to understanding the effects of these institutions are having on people.
Okay.
And that's led me to what I do today, mostly working with institutions and teaching leaders and coaching them how to lead and develop and humanize the institutions they're leading.
Yeah, I love what you just said there about humanize the institution or humanize the leadership that is within the institutions, right? I think everybody is affected. Everyone's affected, from accountants down to someone who is sweeping the floors, right? So thank you so much. And joining me online, I also have Dr. Andrew Blackwood, who's joining us, and he is a public speaker. Again, I've had the pleasure of meeting Andrew through a business colleague of mine, Trevor. Is that correct? That's how we got connected.
That's right.
Andrew's
Yes.
also an author, and he's a father. So he's an author of 2 books. So Andrew, thank you so much. We had a little bit of tech issues, so I'm glad we got through it. Can you tell the folks a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm the father of two daughters and the author of one book. Yeah, no, I recently moved out of Brampton and now I live in the St. Catharines area. That happened during the pandemic. But yeah, so I meet with people virtually. I've been in the mental health profession for over 17 years, and for the past 8 years or so, I've been doing it virtually. The number has grown percentage wise in person versus virtual over the years, but my main thrust is helping people learn how to address emotional pain with care and with competence, because we all experience pain, but not everyone knows how to deal with it well. So whether I'm working with teens or families or individuals and even institutions as well, organizations, there is that human element that it's important to be able to address with both care and competence.
Agree. I think the both of you had um, different paths within your career, but you both touched on very similar experiences as it comes to the human element and the human aspect of what's been happening over the last, I would say, decade. Now that we're in the digital revolution, I'm not sure if the digital revolution was to come or if the pandemic kind of pushed it forward. Makes you wonder what, the cart before the horse, what the actual pivot point was. However, the thing is, no matter what walk of life we're all in, it seems like everyone is at the same point. And the one thing I wanted to address is, as I say that, is we don't really want to address mental health. And I say we, I mean as a collective, community wise. I'm also going to talk about community in terms of visible minority communities. I don't really like to say minorities, so the visible community, if that's fair. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong there. But in terms of racism, right? I mean, I've impacted racism far beyond the pandemic. Um, would you be able to share with me? I know, Andrew, you've shut down your practice, is that correct? And you kind of morphed, you transitioned into another path within administering care. Can you share with me just a little bit of your experiences and also if you can share with us how racism had an impact to it, maybe didn't?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's new. Not a lot of people know this, but I've recently transitioned out of doing psychotherapy and formally into doing the healing communication as the healing communication coach. So I've formalized my own methodology over the years. No, I wouldn't say that racism had anything to do with it. I just had the sense it was time for change. It was a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that everything was going fine with, my practice. Um, but sometimes it's just important to pay attention to that sense that you get when it's time to shift or change then. And that's kind of what happened. So now I am doing the same good quality work. I'm just doing it in a very different way.
Interesting to get your aspect from what's been happening in terms of the wave of, since I would say, Black Lives Matters or George Floyd. I think everyone was impacted. I mean, from the ages of 60s, 70-year-olds, even down to children who saw, what happened on the over the news. How has the community or the network that you work with, how have they been coping with it? Because it's kind of like time has gone by, but has it really died down? Like, have you been finding that um, people are coping in terms of what they saw is no longer a big deal, and or has it trickled into something else? Because I find that there are things that hold us back when we really don't want to address it, so we just kind of put the blinders up and we keep moving, right? Any
My
community that
experience
you
has
can share?
been, yeah, my experience, even with a communal and worldwide trauma like that, although it happened to one person in one place, it really happened to everyone on some scale. So, although it's one incident, the people who witnessed it and experienced it are going to be impacted in different ways. So each time I meet with somebody, I learn how it has impacted them, right? So a lot of people, depending on the kind of trauma that they've experienced, they will be able to cope with it or deal with it in to the degree that they've dealt with other trauma. So if they've never worked through trauma before, they're going to have a more difficult time doing it. And some people cope in healthy ways, and some people cope in unhealthy ways. But ultimately, coping is not necessarily the same as change and growth. So I work with people to define, okay, we cope initially, but then how do we grow through it? And to your point, a lot of people, they have become acclimatized to it, or they've coped with it in such a way. Some people are in denial. Some people, have kind of put it to the side. So for some people, it's reinforced some ideas about racism, about powerlessness. But for other people, they've actually integrated that and then have grown as a result of that. And I'm talking across the board. I'm talking about Black people. I'm talking about people who are not Black. I'm talking about all people. When we experience trauma, it's important to understand how we as individuals deal with trauma and find our path to growing through that so we can grieve. We can grieve what we've lost. And that's the main piece that a lot of people miss. When we experience trauma, there is something that we lose. Yes, there's the hurt, there's the shock, but then there's the loss, whether it's the loss of control, whether it's the loss of this idea that the world was a safe place, that police can be trusted. There's something about that loss. And then when we learn to deal with that and we reconcile that, then we can stand and move forward.
Shifted now to Kashmir from a business lens. If you can share with me or share with the folks, how have you seen leaders cope with the trauma of this, shaking of the systemic approach to dealing with people and dealing with the visible communities? Yeah.
There's been a couple of interesting experiences with it. I live in a very affluent part of Mississauga, and a lot of the people living there are business people.
Okay.
And so, because we all got shut down in quarantine, sitting with neighbors, talking to them became more important than ever before. Like I'd never spoken to some of them, but we're in a closed road and we start talking to each other. So I asked them how they were going through this, and many of them said it was the best thing that ever happened to their business.
Wow.
So many of them owned restaurants, many of them owned hotels. One of my neighbors owned several hotels. And I said to him, it must have been devastating. And he said, no. He said, I could not wish a greater thing, because what happened, he said, the government covered me financially. I laid off all my staff, broke the union, and I brought back youngsters who I can control. And so this has been the biggest boon. And now everybody wants to travel. So we've got now a bifurcated economy where some people have been devastated, as Andrew says, and chronically and acutely, and other people have benefited. And the other side of it is talking to leaders who are trying to get people back to work in their office.
Right.
Because what's happened is for about 25, 30 years, I've been working through the process of trying to create more flexible working arrangements with various companies. They'll invite me and say, well, we want to create a flexible work environment for women, for people who are single parents, for people taking care of the aged, but they never did anything. So I would come up with policies that would never apply them. But what happened in 2 years is circumstances forced that to happen.
Right.
And the distrust they had has been uncovered. The distrust that they had was not that we don't trust you're going to do your work. The distrust was they lose power. So when everybody's working from home and the work's getting done,
Right.
so what happens do you think about the dynamics of a meeting? I go to a meeting, the person who's running the meeting is in control.
Right.
So it's all about the use and abuse of power.
Yes.
That's gone. The meeting space is open. And the work's getting done, and so what we're seeing is middle management getting really afraid that if people can go and do the work and manage with each other,
Right.
what do you need the middle management for? So now the pull to get people back in the office, they claim is for culture and for collaboration, but it isn't. It's to save their own jobs and we've seen in parallel, this has been an acceleration of with agility and lean, the kind of work that you've been doing,
Yes.
that for 20 odd years, people have been trying to work in a more cohesive, coherent, self-regulated way. The pandemic has allowed that to happen.
Right.
And so leaders are in business, some of them are saying it's the greatest thing ever because they're making more money out of it. Others are terrified because it's put the question of their position and power
Right.
into jeopardy.
Oh, wow. So what I'm hearing is coping now has a different approach.
Very much so.
It's
yeah.
not standardized any longer.
No.
The brick and mortar has come down. I mean, I realize, I embrace remote work life. Just being, as you mentioned, being in the agile space of managing projects, managing relationships, and utilizing lean and efficacy to improve how I even plan my day. I actually find that I'm more productive and actually more busy than I ever have been. And that's how I coped with the shutdown. That's how I coped. I don't know what you would call that, Andrew, but with the trauma of what I saw with, with George Floyd. When I saw what happened with George Floyd, the first thing I did was think about my son, how that's going to shape his thinking, how that's going to guide his fears or not. That fearlessness that teenagers and young adults had, that's changed considerably. There were some stats that we talked about, Kashmir, and I'd like to bring those up. And you were sharing with me that divorce rate, and Andrew, you could probably speak to this as well, that CBC News in March of 2021, I believe you said, it was sharing that that divorce rate has gone up. And that there was also a situation where you mentioned that a scenario where couples who were living together, but prior to the pandemic, but really weren't coping with one another because they would find other things outside of the home life to do. But now here they are, restricted, can't leave. And apparently the unfortunate thing is that abuse has gone up. And so physical abuse, unfortunately, women and children are facing the brunt of that. And there were some studies in the UK. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because I understand that Canada has adopted a solution and so has the UK.
I think it originally began in China, where
Okay.
I think several cases where in some areas of China, the amount of domestic abuse had gone up 300%.
Oh, wow.
And it was, we were watching that because this was early in the pandemic, and we're going, oh my gosh, but we didn't know the wave was coming. Then it happened in Italy, then it came in the UK. And then we're watching it, then as the pandemic grew through each of these countries, the rate of abuse, domestic abuse, grew to such a level. A group in Italy, the Italian government, set up a scheme and said, notice they had to do something about this.
Right.
So what they did was they said to women, if you're being abused, when you go to the chemist or the pharmacist, use this word, bring your children with you,
Oh, wow.
and a minibus will take you to a local hotel, because the hotels are all empty. And they were shocked. They started to fill these hotels
And
with
turning them into hostels.
into hostels.
Wow.
And so what I think what happened was the pandemic accelerated what was already there. It didn't create this trauma. It took a trauma that was there and put lights on it. And then the same thing happened in the UK, and then even Trudeau had to pass a similar type of action in Canada.
Right.
So what we see is a universal human issue. And I think part of the issue is that there's, getting back to Andrew was saying about different types of trauma. So we've got to distinguish between acute trauma.
Mm-hmm.
An acute trauma is something that's an event. Somebody dies, there's a rape occurs, or somebody loses their job, or they get divorced, or they go through an event. And the issues with the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd are all about that acute trauma that just hit hard.
Right.
And that never leaves you. It never leaves you. It's
No.
always going to be there.
I agree.
And as Andrew said, it's about really then understanding the grief that you have to go through in order to be in terms and draw from it. But then you've got the chronic abuse, which is more around domestic violence. It's about getting racial slurs. It's about being put down in public. It's about watching a TV show and hearing somebody make you feel small.
Right.
So that chronic abuse has been going on for years. And that requires a different type of response where, in terms of self-consciousness, and that requires us to start looking at our systems
Yeah.
that allow that abuse to perpetuate. And the most dangerous type of abuse, though, because it doesn't get picked up, is what we call complex abuse. And complex abuse is those micro abuses.
Right.
And so things like, just being constantly, quietly being told you're not good enough, or you're not meant to be in power, or you're not the right person.
Oh man.
And so, this is better than anyone in terms of.
Yep.
And Maya Angelou was one of the first people to talk about imposter syndrome. So he's
Right.
one of the greatest poets of our lives, our
Yeah.
times,
Yeah.
who stood shoulder to shoulder with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, saying she suffered from imposter syndrome. So just in case people don't know, imposter syndrome is where you've got to a point where you've been so successful, but you've been told your whole life as a minority or as a woman that you're not good enough. But now you've actually proved them wrong.
Right.
And Michelle Obama spoke about this.
Yeah.
And then the reporters asked her, why are you talking about imposter syndrome? And she said, because girls and minorities need to understand this is a thing. And what's interesting is psychologists have written, I hate to say it, but white old men have actually said it doesn't exist.
Oh wow.
So it's the people so that's what we're dealing with in terms of abuse, is not just the individual grieving and processing, but the systemic issues of society, which a lot of it's rooted in colonialism and control,
Right.
and power and abuse of power, is what we're dealing with.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to stick a pin because you're going where I want to go. Okay, so but I just want to hear from Andrew because Andrew is a psychotherapist. And Andrew, can I get your feedback in terms of what Kashmir just spoke about? Because honestly, you don't know this, but Kashmir and I have spoke a lot about this on a particular project that we're working on. That project is about upskilling. Okay, so it's upskilling visible minorities and immigrants over the last 7 years who have found themselves in a place where they're unemployable because of the wave of the pandemic. So the project really is just from a high level is about identifying and then assessing, so an intake process, and then upskilling them and then helping them to find employment. But I just want to take it back to some of the stuff that Kashmir has just mentioned. You're the clinical specialist here, although he's a historian. He's awesome. He's got information.
Yeah, I love how well you articulated it all, Kashmir. You covered so many important concepts and bases there. Yeah, ultimately, wherever I am and whoever I'm working with, everything that we hear, that we see, that we experience gets incorporated into our sense of identity, right? That's ultimately that's the place where we live from. It's a place that we think from. Um, and so I think what's important to be aware of is we're always taking in information, but we're not always intentionally aware of the information that we're taking in. So one of the things that I incorporate into my life and everyone that I work with is actually journaling. And it's an intentional process of reflecting on your thoughts and your beliefs and your emotions and teasing them apart. Because ultimately, to Maya Angelou's point, and so many people who have talked about imposter syndrome, yes, there is the feedback that you're getting from the world, but ultimately, we have a self concept, a cognitive self concept. This is the information that we have. This is what we can do. This is what we've done. But then we also have an experiential self concept. What does it feel like to be me? Right? What does it really feel like? And this is a place that we actually live from. On the outside, we might behave in particular ways and we show up in particular ways, but on the inside, what does it really feel like to be me? And that's where it's essential to have that awareness and to be moving and growing that part of yourself. And the way that I do that with people is I help them to reverse engineer this thing. Because a lot of the times we perform and we don't make a connection between what I bring as a person to what I do. Like, who am I versus what I can do? And when you start to think about it and you really think, I was just talking to a woman about this yesterday, a successful woman. She retired at the top of her career, but yet she was still not really believing in herself. But when we start to look back at all the things that she did, and we pick one at a time, and we would start to identify, when you did this, what trait were you exhibiting? Because the trait is naturally a part of who you are. Can you see that? And when you reflect on that, it actually feels good to reflect on you are. And the more you do that, you become aware of what it feels like to really be you, and to really be the best of you. And that's a place we want to live from. Because ultimately, when we're entertaining all these other things, it creates a feeling, a sense, whether we're talking about communal trauma or individual trauma, how we take that in, the more we look at that is the more we feel that. But when we can reflect and see that despite that, or even in light of that, I'm still able to do this, the way we feel about ourselves, the way that we see ourselves, that changes.
Right, so imposter syndrome is new to me. Okay. The one thing that's also very new to me as we move ahead here is gaslighting. So, gaslighting, um, I've experienced it twice. And it happens in the business, in the boardroom, happens quite often. What solutions would you say you have for someone who's not in therapy, who's not getting treatment? I had to look it up because I've had friends tell me, you know, that's gaslighting. So basically, the person was trying to convince me that my perceptions of a particular thing was wrong, that I wasn't perceiving my own thoughts and my own beliefs as to be true. So, yeah, I want to hear from the business perspective because you work with a lot of leaders, Kashmir, and then we'll take it over to Andrew.
This goes back to one of the things that maybe we're going to talk about later about unconscious bias.
Yes,
That we
I was
have,
waiting for it.
you know, and really back to what Andrew said about being self-consciousness and self-awareness and being aware of your own identity and what's formed it and what's informing it. I think that's crucial because there's without that foundation, you're vulnerable.
Right, right. So unconscious bias is the person not being aware that they are basically hijacking your personality. Hijacking your personality. Now, this happens a lot in from the corporate right down to general labor.
It happens with doctors, it happens with lawyers, it happens with
Right,
executives,
right.
and they're often in healing and helping careers where they actually think they're helping you.
Right,
They don't think they're trying to control you.
Right.
They're thinking, hey, I'm trying to help. Why doesn't she understand
Yeah.
that? But what they don't realize is that they're caught in a projection
Yeah.
of you. They're not really understanding who
Yeah.
you are.
And they're imposing their will on someone else. I'm going to break down control of it. They're imposing their will on their employees and their coworkers. So now I'm going to take it over to Andrew. Andrew, can you share with me from a healing perspective, how do we heal? How do I find healing for myself? Help the folks who are listening to us today. It's Mental Health Week, and I think what I'd love everyone to take away from this is to be able to have some tools or resources. How do we cope and heal from gaslighting and imposter syndrome?
Yes, well, it's definitely not one thing. There are several things that are really important. So, in order to take care of yourself, it's important to know yourself, right? And a lot of the times we base our opinions and perspectives of ourselves based on other people. And if you're taking your cues from other people to define your worth and your value, then you're always going to be subject to somebody else. So it's important to pull away and acquire the skills to learn how to be with yourself and love yourself, essentially. Because then you can stand in the face of somebody else and say, I have a sense of, I know who I am. So let's step over it a little bit, because into communication with others. So loving yourself is how you communicate with yourself, how you know yourself. But when it comes to engaging with other people, especially when you're dealing with any kind of manipulative behavior, whether it's intentional or not, it's important that we make it explicit, because a lot of the times manipulative and controlling behavior, there is almost a subliminal effect to it, right? It's said, but it's not said. It's more felt and it's more hinted. So whether it's covert or overt, it's important to address it with clarity, to be able to say, what I'm hearing you say is this. Did I get that right? Is this what you are telling me? Right? Because a lot of the times we're caught off guard and we're not prepared and we don't know what to say. But even then, that's okay. You can take that back, take it away, unpack it, right? Separate the feeling. I felt awkward. I felt uncomfortable. I felt, I don't know. Right? You define how that made you feel, right? And then when you return to the conversation, you can say, I was feeling a little bit this way because this is how I interpreted what you said. Is that what you meant to say? And depending on the dynamic, you're going to get some clarity. And if this is not a healthy environment for you to be in, the truth is you do have choices. You do have choices, and it's important to make those choices so that you end up living a life that you are happy with, that you are getting the best and giving the best of yourself too, right?
Much. I think what I'm taking away from all of this is self-care. Self-care, spending time with yourself to realize who you are, who you truly are, and to get the supports and the treatment to help. You know, some people need the help to unpack that. I want to thank you both for your time. I know we had some tech issues, and I'm glad we got through it. I think this was an amazing conversation. I think also that the unconscious bias is a conversation that's going to continue to go on, and the treatment around that. I mean, a lot of times when people think about mental health, they think they have to be popped up on drugs. Yes.
Can I just make as the final concluding
Sure.
suggestion? And I think it's just building on what Andrew just said about journaling. One of the
Yes.
things that maybe we can offer people is to write a letter, write a Dear Maxine letter.
Thank you. Almost forgot that one.
They can,
Kashmir.
and you guys can make it confidential, make it anonymous. But the idea of sitting down and writing a letter and thinking about those three types of abuse: the acute abuse when something traumatic has happened, or the chronic abuse, which has been occurring over time, and then that complex abuse. If you just take a minute and start to think about which of those have affected you, and write a Dear Jan Maxine letter to just get it out of your system.
Yes.
And when you write it, as Andrew's saying, the very process of writing allows you to communicate with yourself.
Right.
And by using Maxine as a mirror. Now, obviously, you don't have to send the letter, but just writing it, I think I would recommend, is a very good first step.
Yeah. I mean, being that I have this community and network of a lot of business people, professionals, and leaders in the community, I lean on professionals like yourself and also, Coach Andrew to support the needs and so forth. So if the community, I mean, hey, if you feel that you want to follow through with writing the letter and sending it in to me, definitely it's confidential, and I will ensure that it gets to the right support and clinicians. Thank you for reminding me of that. Also, if you visit our website with Vibrant Visions, you'll also find that there's somewhere where you can leave a message there as well too. Or you can check us out on Creative Bang Lab website, and you can also send us a comment there. And don't forget to follow, like, and share on YouTube and also on Facebook. Again, before I wrap it up, Andrew, is there anything you'd like to share with the folks?
Yeah, I think quite often the images we see in our world, they really promote a sense of fear and powerlessness. And we're not designed to live in environments like that. So part of taking care of yourself is being intentional about what you take in, what you allow yourself to see and engage in, and that internal environment that you get to cultivate, right? I think that's a really important piece as far as uh, being intentional and being response able to take care of yourself. I think that's really, really important that we have pictures of hope and of positivity and awareness of the life and the good things that are happening, even in the middle of challenges, right? So I think that's a really important thing that we are aware of constantly, that there is life, there is hope, and it's within reach.
Let's wrap up. Thank you very much. There is hope. So, again, thank you all for joining us today. Again, continue to follow and like and subscribe to receive more updates of upcoming episodes. And I appreciate you both for joining us. This week's episode has come to an end. I am Maxine Grant, and this is Vibrant Visions. It's time to be the change you want to see, so get involved. Remember to like or share this episode, and then head on over to our podcast webpage and share your comments and feedback. Join us next time.